Alright, I officially made it to the end of Chapter 4 in Fire in California's Ecosystems, and they saved the best for last, I would say, in this chapter. We're going to be talking about spotting and then also fire severity. And the fire severity section, I think, is especially interesting. But first, we'll go into spotting. I think most people know what this is. It's where burning embers are picked up, they're tossed ahead of the major blaze by wind, and then they can start new little fires. And this can have massive impacts on your rate of fire spread and can end up leading to some pretty dangerous and you could say bad conditions on wildfires. The main reason I say that is I go back to the Dixie Fire. Remember, I was forecasting for the Dixie Fire and things were actually looking decent on the northern edge of the fire. They had put in a huge fuel break, actually using fire to clear out a lot of the fuels, and it stretched for miles, almost surrounding the entire northern edge of the fire. They'd been working on it for days, where especially you put the fire on the ground at night when it's not going to be as intense and you have a bit more control over it to clear out the fuels. So then by the time the major blaze gets there, there's no more fuels to burn and it stops in its tracks. You almost create like a moat around the fire where it can't go past. Unless spotting happens. And that unfortunately is exactly what happened on the Dixie Fire, where some burning embers were picked up, tossed over that fuel break, and then it took off 15 miles in one day. And after that, we ended up having a number of days with pretty extreme wildfire behavior on the Dixie Fire. So when it comes to spotting, there's a few things that are important. It's how high the embers are lifted, the distance that they travel, and then how long they remain burning. And a big part of that is going to be based on how much heat is generated on your fire, because if you have more heat generated on your fire, that's going to heat up the air, and you're going to have a lot of less dense air that wants to rise up, and then that's going to be able to lift those burning embers higher up. And then it also depends on how strong your winds are, because imagine you have a very hot fire, a lot of embers are being lifted up, you have some strong winds come through, and then those are able to carry the embers very far distances. Now that does depend on the size of the ember though, and this is something I didn't know but is pretty interesting, I would say, is your small embers are going to be able to be lifted a lot higher, and they're going to be able to be thrown a lot farther, but they're also not going to burn as long. So those actually aren't the ones that usually lead to your new spot fires, because by the time they land, they've already gone out, or they just don't have enough heat to really ignite the fuels that they've landed into. And that is another important part of this, is the fuels that the embers land into. If they're very dry, obviously it's more likely that a fire is ignited. If they already have a high temperature, it's easier to get those fuels to their ignition temperature. And you typically want, or I don't know if you want this, but if you want a spot fire to happen, there would be a better chance that that ignition occurs if you have very dry, fine fuels that are maybe densely packed. So the ember could heat those up, start a new little fire. And then that leads to the rapid spread, because now you have fires burning in multiple locations that can then combine back together into one. So small embers, lifted very high, travel very far, usually burn out fairly quickly, so they actually don't start as many spot fires. The ones that I'd say you have to worry about are the larger embers, because those aren't going to be lifted as high, they're not going to travel as far, and by the time they land, they're still going to be burning or still generating enough heat that you could have an ignition. So thought that was pretty interesting about spotting, something I never knew. But yeah, watch out for the large embers out there. That's the ones that start more spot fires. Now let's get into fire severity. If you don't know what fire severity is, it's basically the effect that a wildfire has on the environment around it. And I learned something new in this chapter today. I always like those moments where you think you understand something and you've been putting forward an idea based on what you believe to be true, and then as you learn more, you realize that you were actually wrong, or perhaps you only had half the truth, and that the actual reality is much more complicated than you originally assumed. I always like those kind of humbling moments. It makes me want to keep learning more to figure out what else I believe that isn't correct. So what I mean by that is in terms of fire severity, I always thought that those short duration, very extreme wildfires were the ones that were worse for the environment. The ones you maybe see on the news where it turns into a crown fire because fuels have accumulated for decades and then the entire environment just looks like it's been destroyed afterwards. And I always had this kind of rosy picture of the slow burning little surface fire that maybe burns for a much longer period of time, but it doesn't go up into the canopy, it doesn't turn into a crown fire, the trees remain untouched, and it just kind of creeps along the ground and reduces your fuels, which I thought was beneficial to the environment because it supports and protects the trees. But again, you always have to think about, we're not just saying, okay, trees are good, so anything that's good for the trees is a good wildfire, because there's lots of different things in the ecosystem and it's all actually connected together. So what I learned today is that those longer burning, less intense fires that are more along the surface can actually be much more harmful for your soils, because it just kind of is too hot for your soils and then it can damage the soils. And I'd imagine some of the bacteria and the important stuff that's within soil. Trying to go back to my old Cal Poly days where I was taking a lot of soil science classes, but I've definitely forgotten a fair bit since then. But then, again, you could also say that would then be bad for your trees as well, because the trees rely on the soil. So, unfortunately, there's not just some simple answer of what's a good fire, what's a bad fire. There's pros and cons to anything, and I'd imagine it's just looking at the current situation, the current conditions, your specific environment that you're talking about, where you would determine what the pros and the cons are. What's true for Southern California is going to be different for Northern California. It's going to be different for the Sierra or the Chaparral. And all the different environments have their own little nuances, which is important. So that's introduction to fire severity. Now we can kind of dive into the weeds of different aspects of fire severity. So again, fire severity is the effect that the wildfire has on the environment around it. So one of those is going to be something called scorching, and that's where the internal temperature of your leaves or your needles becomes so hot that it's lethal. And then that is more likely, obviously, the hotter the fire is. And there's actually some exact numbers to this. If the heat around your leaves or your needles is 120 degrees, it takes about an hour for that scorching to occur, where the leaves, needles reaches that lethal level. If you're at 130 degrees, that lethal level can be reached in minutes. And then if you reach 147 degrees, and I'm talking about Fahrenheit here, we're in America. If you reach 147 degrees, then it can happen instantaneously. Now, the obvious part of this is the hotter the fire is, the closer you are going to be to those temperatures, so then the easier it is for that scorching to occur. And then the taller your flames are, the closer they're also going to be to maybe your canopy or your leaves or your needles. So then that's going to have impacts on your scorch height. And that is two aspects of scorching, is the height to which your scorching occurs within the tree. Maybe it doesn't scorch the entire tree, maybe it's just half of it, the bottom half usually. But then also percent of the canopy that is scorched. Like maybe the whole tree goes, or maybe just 15%. So just bringing it back a little bit, what's important? How hot the fire is, how warm the air temperatures are around it. That one's pretty intuitive. If you have higher air temperatures, you're going to be closer to those 120, 130, 147 thresholds. And then the one that I didn't realize is that wind in this situation can actually be a good thing. So again, this is somewhere where there's a bit of nuance, because if you have wind, you can have a more extreme fire, which means more heat could be generated. However, wind is also going to push in more cooler air. More cooler, I don't know if that's correct grammar, but it could push in cooler air, so that could reduce the amount of scorching that occurs. Now, the reason scorching is important is we get into our next little vocab word here under fire severity, which is plant mortality. So plant mortality, You probably already know what it is based on the name, but it's when an entire plant is either consumed by fire or enough of its tissues have been significantly damaged to the point where the plant is basically dead. So the largest predictor for plant mortality within trees, at least according to Fire in California's ecosystems, isn't so much your scorching height, but it's going to be the percent of the canopy that was scorched. So more percent of the canopy that's scorched, the higher probability that your tree has that, goes into the category of plant mortality. Now, what I think is one of my favorite things that I've learned about wildfire over this last year is that there's actually some plants out there that above the surface, they can look like they were completely destroyed. And you would say, oh, that plant's definitely dead. Plant mortality right there. But these plants actually have what's called a burl, or it's different with a lot of plants. I'm mostly just talking about chamise right here. It has a burl that's underground, which is a reserve of resources. So the entire top of the plant can look like it's destroyed, but it actually has a bunch of reserves underground, and then that can re-sprout after the fire, which is actually a pretty good time to re-sprout because a lot of the competition has been reduced, and then the plant that you might have thought was dead is actually coming back to life almost like a phoenix. So that's plant mortality. Next, we could talk about biomass consumption. Not going to spend a whole lot of time on this one because it makes perfect sense. The hotter the fire is, the more heat that's being generated, and the drier your fuels are, the more biomass is going to be consumed. Now, the interplay between those two things, the reason that your dry fuels are important for this, is because if you have a lot of moisture in your fuels, think of your fire that's coming up to your plants, and before you can before those fuels can combust, that's the word I was looking for, combustion. Before that happens, the moisture has to be evaporated out of those fuels. And then the fuels also have to reach their ignition temperature. So in order for that to happen, it requires heat from the fire. So if your plants have more moisture in them, that's going to require more heat from the fire. And you can almost think of that as the fire wasting its energy, having to evaporate the moisture out of your plants, having to raise their ignition temperature, and then combustion occurs. So if you have very dry fuels, or if they're already closer to their ignition temperature because it's very warm out, then the fire comes along, doesn't have to waste all that much energy evaporating the moisture, doesn't have to waste that much energy getting that plant to its ignition temperature. Combustion just occurs like that, and then it just continues on. And the key point I'm putting forward here is that more of the fire's energy can be used for combustion. So you would have more biomass consumed than if more of the fire's energy is used for evaporation and raising the temperature of the plants. So then you have less energy on the fire left over to consume the biomass, so you'd have less biomass consumed. That was probably a very confusing way of explaining something that's actually very simple. Hotter the fire, drier the fuels, the more fuels are going to burn. That summarizes it. Now the last one I actually saved the best for last here, and it's how a wildfire can influence the microclimate. This is something I'd never really thought about before, but if you have maybe a crown fire or you have some torching where the canopy of a tree maybe reaches or it scorches, and then you have maybe some plant mortality, that tree dies, now all of a sudden your canopy is a lot more open than it was before, and that's going to allow a lot more sunlight in. So if you have more sunlight coming in, that's going to be able to reach the surface, and that's going to warm the surface more. That's going to lead to higher air temperatures, which is going to lead to lower relative humidity, which is going to lead to lower fuel moistures, which makes it more likely you have a fire in the future. So just thought that was very interesting. I could sum it up again. If you have a fire come through, destroy some of the canopy, kill some of your trees, that impacts the weather that you have in this area. Because with the canopy open, more sunlight comes through, warmer air, drier fuels, and then that can actually impact your fire regime in the future, because maybe before your surface fuels were pretty shaded, they stayed nice and moist. Now it's a lot hotter and drier, so fire has become more likely because of fire in the past. Thought that was interesting. We've wrapped up chapter 4. I'm going to do kind of a summary video on chapter 4 tomorrow, so you can stay tuned for that. You can stay tuned as well as I continue to make my way through this massive monster of a book. 4 chapters done, long way to go. So if you want to come along on this journey with me, you can continue watching, and thank you for watching as well.